The butterfly, as Sarah would have said, was finally ready to fly. When a single father's promise to leave violence behind collides with his daughter's plea for justice, one moment of courage will ignite a war that threatens everything he holds dear. Welcome to tonight's story, one that will take you on a journey through the heart of America, where ordinary people face extraordinary choices. I invite you to stay with me until the very end of this tale, and please comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across our great nation. The rain drummed against the windows of Murphy's Diner, like impatient fingers, each drop catching the amber glow of the old neon sign that had welcomed travelers for 3 decades. Inside, the familiar symphony of clinking silverware and hushed conversations created a cocoon of warmth against the October chill that had settled over the small town of Cedar Falls. Ethan Cole sat in booth 7, the same worn vinyl seat he'd claimed every Friday night for the past 6 months. His calloused hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had seen better days, steam rising like prayers into the dim light. Across from him, 10-year-old Lily Cole swung her legs beneath the table, her sneakers barely grazing the checkered linoleum floor. "Dad, you're doing it again," Lily said, her voice carrying that particular mix of affection and exasperation that only children could master. "Doing what, sweetheart?" Ethan's voice was gravelly worn smooth by years of barked orders and whispered lullabies. "That thing where you watch everyone." She gestured around the diner with her fork, a piece of apple pie balanced precariously on the end. "Mom used to say you had eyes like a hawk." The mention of Sarah hit Ethan like it always did a sudden ache that had learned to live quietly in his chest. 3 years since the cancer took her, and Lily still spoke of her mother in present tense sometimes, as if love could transcend the boundaries of time and mortality. "Your mom was a smart woman," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Smartest person I ever knew. She said it's because you were a soldier, that soldiers never really stop watching." Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The weight of his past pressed against his shoulders like an old injury that ached before storms. Navy SEAL Team 6, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Missions that existed only in classified files and the nightmares that still visited him in the small hours of the morning. "I'm not a soldier anymore, Lily. I'm just your dad who happens to notice things. Like how Mrs. Henderson puts extra gravy on my mashed potatoes because she thinks I'm too skinny. Exactly like that." Ethan chuckled, and this time the smile was genuine. "And like how you've been pushing those green beans around your plate for 10 minutes, hoping I won't notice." Lily's eyes widened with mock innocence. "Green beans are vegetables, Dad. They're supposed to be good for you, but these taste like they've been punishing someone. Eat 3 more bites and we'll call it even." 2 bites. Deal. This was their ritual, their sacred space carved out of a week filled with construction sites, homework, battles, and the constant juggling act of single parenthood. Murphy's Diner wasn't much to look at: cracked leather seats, a jukebox that played the same 20 songs from the 80s, and coffee that could strip paint, but it was theirs. Ethan's eyes swept the room with practiced efficiency. Old habits died hard, and situational awareness had been drilled into him until it became as natural as breathing. The elderly couple by the window celebrating their anniversary with shared pie. The trucker at the counter nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and reading yesterday's newspaper. The group of teenagers in the corner booth, all phones and whispered secrets. And then there was the woman at the bar. She sat alone, professional in her crisp white blouse and navy blazer, a laptop open before her. Claire Bennett, though Ethan didn't know her name yet, had the kind of understated elegance that spoke of courtrooms and boardrooms. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore the focused expression of someone accustomed to solving other people's problems. She was also in trouble. Ethan noticed them before she did two men approaching from the bar's far end. Their gait was predatory, purposeful. The first was tall and broad-shouldered, expensive suit, barely containing the bulk of someone who'd spent more time in gyms than boardrooms. Marcus Holloway, though, again names were just details Ethan would learn later. The second man was smaller, but carried himself with the coiled tension of a street fighter. Derek Nash, Marcus's perpetual shadow and enabler. "Dad." Lily's voice seemed to come from far away. "You're doing the hawk thing again." Ethan forced his attention back to his daughter, but his peripheral vision remained locked on the unfolding scene across the diner. Marcus had positioned himself beside Claire's stool, too close for politeness, his hand resting on the bar in a way that trapped her between his body and the wall. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Ethan said, but his voice had taken on an edge that made Lily look up from her pie. The conversation at the bar started quietly, Marcus leaning in with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to getting his way. Claire's body language was polite but firm, her shoulders squared in a way that suggested this wasn't her first encounter with unwanted attention. "I appreciate the offer." Claire's voice carried across the diner, professionally courteous, but unmistakably final. "But I'm here to work." "Come on, beautiful. It's Friday night. Nobody works on Friday night." Marcus's laugh was too loud, too familiar. "One drink. What's the harm in one drink?" Derek positioned himself on Claire's other side, effectively boxing her in. The classic pincer movement. Ethan's muscles tensed involuntarily, old training flooding his system like water through a broken dam. "I said no thank you." Claire's voice remained steady, but Ethan caught the slight tremor underneath. Fear disguised as firmness. "Dad?" Lily's voice was smaller now, uncertain. "Why isn't anyone helping her?" Ethan's eyes swept the diner again. The elderly couple was studiously avoiding the scene, their anniversary dinner suddenly requiring intense concentration. The trucker had his back turned, shoulders hunched. The teenagers were filming with their phones, more interested in content than conscience. "She said no," Claire repeated louder this time. "Please leave me alone." Marcus's hand moved to her shoulder, and Claire flinched away. The laptop screen flickered as her elbow bumped the table. "Don't be like that," Marcus said, his voice taking on an edge. "I'm trying to be nice here. You don't want to make this difficult." The diner held its collective breath. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the jukebox seemed to lower its volume as if the machine itself sensed the shift in atmosphere. "Daddy." Lily's voice was a whisper now, but it cut through Ethan's consciousness like a blade. "Can we help her?" Time stretched like taffy. Ethan's promise to Sarah echoed in his memory: no more violence, no more wars, no more missions that took him away from the daughter who needed him. He'd hung up his uniform, traded his rifle for a hammer, his tactical vest for a hard hat. He was a construction foreman now, a single father, trying to build a peaceful life from the rubble of loss. But his daughter's eyes were wide with confusion and something else, disappointment. Not in the situation, but in the world's response to it. In the way good people could sit still and silent while cruelty played out before them. "Why isn't anyone helping?" Lily asked again, her voice carrying the weight of a question that would shape her understanding of justice, courage, and the price of inaction. Ethan looked at his daughter. Really looked at her. 10 years old, and already learning that the world could be a place where the strong preyed on the weak, while others watched. Learning that sometimes good people did nothing, and that nothing was a choice with consequences that rippled far beyond the moment of decision. Marcus's voice grew more insistent, more threatening. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Derek laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Come on, sweetheart. Marcus here comes from a very important family. You don't want to make enemies. Claire's laptop screen went dark, and in its reflection, Ethan saw her face pale, frightened, trapped between two men who had turned her quiet workspace into a cage. The promise he'd made to Sarah warred with the promise he'd made to himself long before he'd ever met his wife. The promise to stand between those who couldn't defend themselves and those who would do them harm. The promise that had carried him through hell and back through missions that had no names and victories that would never see the light of day. But this wasn't Afghanistan. This wasn't some foreign battlefield where the rules of engagement were written in blood and classified ink. This was Murphy's Diner in Cedar Falls, where the biggest excitement was usually the Friday night high school football game, and the most controversial topic was whether to replace the old jukebox. She asked you to leave her alone. Ethan's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Every head in the diner turned. Marcus and Derek looked up, surprise flickering across their faces. Claire's eyes met Ethan's across the room, and he saw relief there mixed with something else, hope. Ethan stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. 6 feet 2 inches of muscle and sinew shaped by years of military training and honest construction work. His jeans were faded, his flannel shirt rolled up to reveal forearms marked by scars and calluses. He didn't look like much, just another working man at the end of a long week. But Marcus and Derek were looking at him now with the sudden uncertainty of men who had misjudged their situation. "This doesn't concern you, friend," Marcus said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. Ethan took a step forward, then another. His movement was unhurried but purposeful, like a storm front advancing across an open plain. The lady said no. That's where this conversation ends. "Dad." Lily's voice was barely audible, but it carried layers of meaning. Pride, fear, confusion, love. She was watching her father become something she'd never seen before, not just her protector, but a protector of others. Derek stepped away from the bar, his hand moving to his jacket. Ethan's eyes tracked the movement with predatory focus. Combat knife, probably. Maybe a pistol. Derek had the build and movements of someone who'd done time institutional muscle hiding behind expensive clothes. "You need to walk away," Derek said, his voice carrying the kind of menace that had probably worked in a dozen previous confrontations. "This is none of your business." Ethan was close enough now to smell the alcohol on Marcus's breath, to see the expensive watch on his wrist, to count the days since Derek's last shave. Close enough to end this in a dozen different ways, each one clinical and efficient. When two men corner a woman who's asked them to leave her alone, it becomes everyone's business, Ethan said. His voice was steady, conversational even, but there was something underneath it that made the hair on the back of necks stand up throughout the diner. Marcus tried to salvage his dignity with bluster. "Do you know who I am? Do you know who my family is?" "No," Ethan said simply. "And I don't care." The silence stretched taut as a wire. Claire remained frozen between the two men, her breathing shallow and quick. The elderly couple had stopped pretending to eat. The trucker had turned around, his expression a mixture of fascination and fear. Even the teenagers had lowered their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something that would change them. "Last chance," Derek said, his hand now resting openly on whatever was concealed beneath his jacket. "Walk away." Ethan's response was to take another step forward. He was within arm's reach now, close enough to see the uncertainty flickering behind Marcus's bravado, close enough to smell the desperation that always preceded violence. "The lady asked you to leave," Ethan repeated, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had once commanded elite soldiers in the world's most dangerous places. "So you're going to leave." Marcus's face flushed red with humiliation and rage. The situation had spiraled beyond his control, and he knew it. But backing down in front of an audience, especially in front of a woman he'd been trying to intimidate, wasn't an option his ego could accept. "You picked the wrong fight, old man," Marcus snarled, and his fist came up in a wide, telegraphed swing that might have worked in a bar full of drunk college kids. But Ethan Cole wasn't a college kid, and he wasn't drunk. Time seemed to slow as Ethan's training took over. Muscle memory forged in the crucible of special operations flowed through him like water finding its level. He moved with economical precision, stepping inside Marcus's swing and redirecting the momentum with a simple wrist control that sent the larger man stumbling past him. Derek's hand was moving toward his weapon when Ethan's elbow found his solar plexus with surgical accuracy. The air rushed out of Derek's lungs in a whoosh, and he doubled over, gasping. Marcus recovered his balance and spun around fury, replacing calculation. This time he came in low, trying to tackle Ethan around the waist. It was a football move, crude but potentially effective against an ordinary opponent. Ethan wasn't ordinary. He sprawled backward using Marcus's momentum against him, wrapping his arm around the man's neck in a blood choke that every SEAL learned in week 1 of training. Marcus's struggles grew weaker as the pressure built, his face darkening. "Sleep." Ethan whispered, his voice gentle as a lullaby. Marcus went limp, unconscious, but unharmed. Ethan lowered him to the floor with the care of someone placing a sleeping child in a crib. Derek was still struggling for breath, his hand fumbling for his weapon. Ethan stepped forward and placed his hand over Derek's, not roughly, but with enough pressure to make his intentions clear. "Don't," Ethan said simply. Derek looked up into eyes that had seen too much death to be impressed by threats, and whatever he saw there made him slowly remove his hand from his jacket. "Smart choice," Ethan said. He looked down at Marcus, who was beginning to stir. "When your friend wakes up, you're both going to apologize to the lady. Then you're going to leave, and you're not going to come back." Derek nodded, still breathing hard. "Who the hell are you?" Ethan glanced back at his daughter, who was watching with wide eyes and an expression of awe that made his heart clench. "I'm just a dad having dinner with his little girl." The diner slowly came back to life around them. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. The elderly couple finally took another bite of their pie. The trucker turned back to his newspaper, but his hands were shaking slightly as he turned the page. Claire stood up on unsteady legs, her professional composure cracked but holding. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "Nothing would have happened," Ethan said firmly. "Not here, not tonight." Marcus groaned and sat up, his hand going to his throat. His eyes found Ethan's face, and for a moment hatred blazed there, bright enough to light the darkest corners of the diner. "This isn't over," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. "Yes, it is," Ethan replied. "You apologize to the lady, and then you leave. That's how this ends." The weight of a dozen stares pressed down on Marcus. The elderly couple, the trucker, the teenagers, even the waitress who had emerged from the kitchen, all of them waiting to see what kind of man he really was when stripped of the protection that intimidation usually provided. "I'm sorry," Marcus mumbled, not meeting Claire's eyes. "Louder," Ethan said. "I'm sorry," Marcus repeated, his voice carrying across the diner like a confession. Derek helped his friend to his feet, and together they stumbled toward the door. Marcus paused at the threshold, looking back with eyes that promised retribution. "I know where you work," he said. "I know who you are now." Ethan met his gaze steadily. "Then you know I'm not hard to find." The door closed behind them with a chime that sounded almost cheerful after the tension of the last few minutes. The diner exhaled collectively, like a held breath finally released. Claire was gathering her things with hands that shook slightly. Her laptop, her papers, her purse, the tools of a professional life that had suddenly seemed very fragile. "Let me give you my card," she said, pulling out a business card with hands that had steadied. "Claire Bennett, civil rights attorney. If there's ever anything I can do—" "That's not necessary," Ethan said, but she pressed the card into his hand anyway. "It is to me," she said. "What you did tonight. Most people would have just watched. Most people don't have daughters asking them why nobody helps," Ethan replied, glancing back at Lily, who was still sitting in the booth, her pie forgotten. Claire followed his gaze and smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed since the confrontation began. "She's lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Ethan said, and meant it. Claire gathered the rest of her things and headed for the door. She paused beside their booth on her way out. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said to Lily. "For caring enough to ask your dad to help." Lily beamed up at her. "Dad says good people help other people, even when it's scary." "Your dad is a very wise man," Claire said, "and a very brave one." After she left, the diner slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed their natural rhythm. The elderly couple finished their pie and left hand in hand. The trucker paid his check and headed back to his rig. The teenagers reluctantly put away their phones when the manager asked them to respect other customers' privacy. Ethan slid back into the booth across from his daughter, his coffee cold, now his hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. "Dad?" Lily's voice was small, uncertain. "Yes, sweetheart. Are you going to get in trouble?" The question hit him harder than Marcus's clumsy punch had. She was 10 years old, but she understood that actions had consequences, that standing up sometimes meant standing alone. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe. Probably. Was it worth it?" Ethan looked at his daughter, really looked at her. 10 years old, and already grappling with questions that many adults never had the courage to face. Questions about justice and consequence, about the price of doing right in a world that often rewarded looking away. "What do you think?" he asked. Lily considered this with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. "I think that lady was really scared. And I think those men were really mean, and I think—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I think if we don't help people when they need help, then who will?" "That's exactly right," Ethan said, his voice thick with pride. "That's exactly right." They finished their dinner in comfortable silence, the weight of the evening settling around them like a familiar blanket. Outside, the rain had stopped, and stars were beginning to peek through the breaking clouds. As they walked to the truck, Lily slipped her small hand into his large one. "Dad, what is it, sweetheart? I'm proud of you." Ethan stopped walking, kneeling down until he was at her eye level. The parking lot was empty, except for their old pickup truck and the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. "Lily, I want you to understand something. What happened tonight, what I did, it's not always the answer. Most problems, most conflicts, they get solved with words, with talking, with finding common ground. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't," he agreed. "And when someone is being hurt, when someone can't protect themselves, then good people have to make a choice. They can look away or they can stand up. And you chose to stand up." "We chose to stand up," he corrected. "If you hadn't asked me to help, if you hadn't cared enough to notice she was in trouble, I might have just watched like everyone else." Lily hugged him, then her small arms barely reaching around his broad shoulders. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, sweetheart. More than all the stars in the sky." They drove home through streets that seemed different somehow, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Ethan's mind was already working through the implications of what had happened. Marcus's threat hadn't been idle. He knew where Ethan worked, and men with expensive suits and dangerous friends didn't forget being humiliated in public. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror at Lily, who had fallen asleep against the window, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not the cold satisfaction of a mission completed or an enemy neutralized, but the warm certainty that came from doing the right thing for the right reasons. He was a father first, a protector second, and a warrior only when the first two demanded it. Tonight they had. The house was dark when they pulled into the driveway, its modest frame and small yard a testament to simpler dreams and harder realities. Ethan carried Lily inside her head, resting against his shoulder, as he navigated the familiar path to her bedroom. As he tucked her in, she stirred slightly. "Dad, I'm here, sweetheart. Will you tell me the story about Mom and the butterfly again?" It was her favorite story, the one about how Sarah had spent an entire afternoon in their garden helping a butterfly with a damaged wing. How she'd created a little shelter and fed it sugar water until it was strong enough to fly again. "Your mom found this butterfly." Ethan began, his voice soft in the darkness. It was just lying there on the sidewalk, its wing torn and twisted. As he told the familiar story, Ethan's mind wandered to the evening's events, to Claire's frightened eyes and his daughter's simple question, to the choice he'd made and the consequences that would follow. Outside the town of Cedar Falls, settled into sleep, unaware that the balance of power had shifted in a small diner, unaware that a single father's promise to leave violence behind had collided with his daughter's faith in justice. And in the darkness, forces were already moving. Phone calls were being made. Favors were being called in. Plans were being set in motion that would test everything Ethan Cole believed about the price of doing right in a world that often punished those who stood up. But for now, in this moment, there was only the soft sound of his daughter's breathing and the knowledge that when she had asked him to help, he had found the courage to say yes. The war was coming, but tonight, love had won. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Ethan's bedroom like golden fingers painting stripes across the hardwood floor Sarah had insisted on refinishing during her last summer. He'd been awake for 20 minutes, lying still and listening to the familiar sounds of Cedar Falls coming to life. Garbage trucks rumbling down Maple Street, Mrs. Henderson's rooster crowing, despite the city ordinance against farm animals, the distant whistle of the 647 freight train carrying grain to the processing plant outside town. But this morning felt different. The events at Murphy's Diner played through his mind like a film reel stuck on repeat, each frame sharp with consequence. Marcus Holloway's face when he'd hit the floor, Derek's hand moving toward his weapon, the weight of every eye in that diner watching him become something more or perhaps less than just another single father trying to make ends meet. "Dad?" Lily's voice drifted down the hallway, followed by the soft padding of bare feet on cold wood. "Can we have pancakes?" Ethan smiled, despite the knot in his stomach. Saturday morning pancakes were their tradition, started the first weekend after Sarah's funeral, when neither of them had known how to navigate the terrible silence of grief. Food had become a bridge between them, a language they could speak when words failed. "Extra chocolate chips," he called back, already knowing the answer. "Is there any other kind?" In the kitchen, morning light revealed the modest details of their life together. Lily's artwork covering the refrigerator like a gallery of hope. Sarah's coffee mug still sitting in the cabinet, where Ethan couldn't bring himself to move it. The small herb garden visible through the window, overgrown now, but still producing the rosemary Sarah had planted for remembrance. As Ethan mixed batter, his phone buzzed against the counter. A text from his foreman, Mike Torres, need to talk. Office, 8 a.m. The knot in his stomach tightened. Mike was a good man, fair and direct, but he answered to people who answered to other people, and small-town construction companies lived or died by their reputation. Last night's confrontation had probably already made the rounds. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where news traveled faster than gossip, and gossip traveled at the speed of light. "Dad, you're doing the worry face again," Lily observed from her perch at the kitchen table, still in her pajamas decorated with cartoon astronauts. "Just thinking about work, sweetheart." "Are you in trouble because of last night?" The question hit him like a physical blow. She was 10 years old, but she understood cause and effect with the clarity that children sometimes possessed the ability to see truth without the comfortable lies adults told themselves. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." "Okay." "Okay." She was quiet for a moment, watching him pour batter into the skillet. "Dad, what is it? I'm still glad you helped her." The simple statement carried the weight of absolution. Whatever consequences awaited him, whatever price he'd have to pay for choosing action over safety, his daughter's moral compass pointed true north. That had to count for something. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, the morning routine a familiar anchor in uncertain waters. Lily chattered about her plans for the day: Saturday art class at the community center, followed by a sleepover at her best friend Emma's house. Normal 10-year-old concerns in a world that had suddenly become less predictable. At 7:30, Ethan dropped Lily off at the community center, watching through the rearview mirror as she skipped up the steps with the unconscious joy of childhood. She turned and waved before disappearing through the double doors, and something in his chest clenched with fierce protectiveness. Torres Construction occupied a converted warehouse on the edge of town's industrial district, surrounded by the controlled chaos of American enterprise concrete, mixing trucks, stacks of lumber that reached toward the sky like wooden prayers, and the constant sound of progress measured in hammer blows and diesel engines. Mike Torres stood outside the main office, a cup of coffee steaming in the crisp air. He was a compact man in his 50s, weathered by decades of honest work and honest dealing. When he saw Ethan approaching, his expression was carefully neutral, the face of a man preparing to deliver bad news. "Morning, Ethan." "Mike." Ethan joined him, accepting the offered cup of coffee. "I'm guessing this isn't about the Henderson job." "You'd be guessing right." Mike took a long sip, gathering his thoughts. "Got a call this morning, early, from Richard Holloway." The name hung in the air between them like smoke from a house fire. Richard Holloway, CEO of Holloway Development, the company that owned half the commercial real estate in Cedar Falls and most of the politicians who regulated the other half. "Marcus's father," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "The same." Mike's voice carried the weariness of a man who'd spent his career navigating the narrow space between doing right and doing business. "He was very interested in one of my employees, specifically one Ethan Cole, who apparently had an altercation with his son last night." "That's one way to describe it." "Is it true what they're saying happened at Murphy's?" Ethan met his friend's eyes directly. In 15 years of military service, he'd learned that truth was often the only weapon worth carrying. Marcus Holloway and his friend were harassing a woman. She asked them to stop. They didn't. I convinced them to reconsider. "Jesus, Ethan." Mike ran a hand through his gray hair. "Do you know what you've done? Do you know who that family is? I know they're rich. I know they're connected. I know they think that gives them the right to do whatever they want to whoever they want." "It does give them that right," Mike said quietly. "Not legally maybe, but practically. The Holloway family has been in this county for 4 generations. They own the bank, they own the newspaper, they sit on the school board and the city council. When Richard Holloway sneezes, half this town reaches for tissues. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a black sedan, expensive and out of place among the pickup trucks and work vans that usually filled the parking lot. It moved with the predatory grace of authority coming to rest directly in front of the office entrance. The man who emerged wore a suit that cost more than Ethan's monthly mortgage. Richard Holloway himself, silver-haired and handsome, in the way that money could buy, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd never heard the word no without immediately making it disappear. "Mr. Torres," Holloway said, his voice carrying the particular authority of inherited power. "Thank you for accommodating this early meeting." "Mr. Holloway," Mike's voice was carefully respectful. "This is Ethan Cole." Holloway's gaze settled on Ethan with the weight of evaluation. "Mr. Cole, the man who assaulted my son. The man who stopped your son from assaulting someone else," Ethan replied evenly. Holloway's smile was sharp as winter frost. "I see. And you feel qualified to make that determination. You have some expertise in legal matters. I have expertise in right and wrong." How refreshingly simple. Holloway's tone suggested anything but admiration for simplicity. "Mr. Cole, I'm a reasonable man. I understand that situations can be misinterpreted, particularly when alcohol is involved, as I'm told it was last night. Your son was sober enough to corner a woman and ignore her when she asked him to leave her alone. My son tells a different story. He says he was having a friendly conversation with an attractive woman when you initiated an unprovoked attack. The lie sat between them like a living thing, poisonous and patient. Ethan felt the familiar surge of anger that had once driven him through firefights and hostile Shalmut territory, but years of fatherhood had taught him the difference between anger that served and anger that destroyed. "There were witnesses," Ethan said. "Were there?" Holloway's expression suggested he found this amusing. "Funny thing about witnesses, Mr. Cole. Their memories can be unreliable, particularly when they have mortgages to pay, businesses to run, families to protect." The threat was delivered with the casual elegance of a man accustomed to having his words obeyed. Mike Torres shifted uncomfortably beside them, caught between loyalty and pragmatism. "What do you want?" Ethan asked. "What I want is very simple. I want you to disappear." "I'm not going anywhere." "No." Holloway pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed dossier. Ethan Michael Cole, age 38, Navy SEAL, discharged with honors after 15 years of service. Married to Sarah Elizabeth Cole, deceased. Father to Lily Ann Cole, age 10. Currently employed as construction foreman, annual salary $48,000. Rents a 3-bedroom house on Elm Street for $900 a month. Each fact landed like a physical blow. The casual recitation of his life's details, the reduction of his family to data points in some corporate database. "Lives paycheck to paycheck," Holloway continued. "Credit score of 612, no savings to speak of, entirely dependent on continued employment for survival." "Mr. Holloway." Mike interjected, his voice tight with discomfort. "Ethan's a good worker. He's never caused any trouble before." "Before" being the operative phrase, Mr. Torres. "You see, Mr. Cole, I've done some research since my son's unfortunate encounter with your heroics. Your military record makes for interesting reading. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Quite the violent resume." "I served my country." "You killed people. Efficiently and without remorse, from what I'm told." Which raises an interesting question. What's a trained killer doing living quietly in our peaceful little town? What's he running from? The insinuation hit its mark. Ethan felt the familiar weight of his past pressing against his chest, the accumulated burden of missions that had no names and victories that could never be celebrated. I'm not running from anything. I'm building a life for my daughter. How admirable, and how fragile. Holloway's smile was all teeth and winter, a life that depends entirely on your continued employment, your continued reputation as a stable member of this community. Amazing how quickly that can change. Are you threatening me? I'm educating you about the way things work in the real world, about cause and effect, about the price of poor decision-making. Mike Torres looked like a man watching a car accident in slow motion. Mr. Holloway, maybe we could work something out. Some kind of compromise. The only compromise, Holloway said, his voice cutting through Mike's words like a blade, is Mr. Cole's immediate resignation and departure from Cedar Falls. Tonight. That's not happening, Ethan said. No. Then let me paint you a picture of your immediate future. By Monday morning, you'll be unemployed. Mr. Torres here will receive a call informing him that Holloway Development is reconsidering its contracts with Torres Construction. Something about concerns over employee stability. Mike's face went pale. Holloway Development contracts represented 60% of Torres Construction's annual revenue. The loss would be catastrophic. By Tuesday, Holloway continued, your landlord will receive notice that your lease is being terminated due to complaints about noise and property damage. Complaints filed by concerned neighbors who suddenly remember all sorts of disturbing incidents. That's illegal. Prove it. By Wednesday, Child Protective Services will receive an anonymous tip about an unstable veteran living alone with a minor child. Someone will mention your military background, your violent confrontation with upstanding members of the community, your obvious inability to control your aggressive impulses. The words hit Ethan like physical blows, the systematic destruction of his life delivered with the casual precision of someone reading a grocery list. They'll want to investigate, of course, just to be safe, just to make sure little Lily is in a stable environment. And during that investigation, they'll discover all sorts of concerning things. Financial instability, unemployment, a history of violence. You son of a bitch. Language, Mr. Cole. Not very appropriate for a father, is it? The kind of thing that might concern a judge when determining custody arrangements. The threat to Lily crystallized everything. Ethan's hands clenched involuntarily, and Holloway noticed the movement with satisfaction. There it is, Holloway said softly. The violence just beneath the surface. The reason you really left the military, perhaps. Some incident that made continued service inadvisable. That's enough, Mike said, his voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone, including himself. Mr. Holloway, I think you've made your point. Have I, Mr. Torres? Because I want to be absolutely clear. Mr. Cole has 24 hours to leave Cedar Falls voluntarily. After that, things become unpleasant. Holloway turned to go, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Cole. That attorney your little encounter produced Ms. Bennett. She's received some very interesting job offers in other cities. Amazing opportunities that would be difficult to refuse. It seems the legal community has suddenly recognized her exceptional talents. With that, he climbed back into his sedan and drove away, leaving behind the stench of power corrupted and money weaponized against justice. Mike Torres stood in the aftermath, his coffee cup forgotten in his hand, steam rising like prayers into the morning air. Jesus Christ, Ethan, what have you gotten us into? I stopped two men from hurting a woman. And now he's going to destroy both of us for it. Mike's voice carried the weight of a man watching his life's work crumble. You know I can't fight him. Torres Construction employs 43 people. They all have families, mortgages, kids in school. I know. If I lose those contracts, we all go under. Not just me, everyone who works here. I know. So what are you going to do? Ethan looked around the construction yard at the honest tools of honest work, at the men beginning to arrive for their Saturday shifts. Good men who'd done nothing wrong except work for a company that employed someone who'd stood up to the wrong person's son. I don't know yet, he said quietly, but I'm not running. Maybe you should consider it. Maybe running is the smart play here. And teach my daughter that good people back down when bad people threaten them, that justice is only for people who can afford it. Mike didn't have an answer for that. Few people did. Ethan's phone buzzed with a text message. The number was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. We need to talk. Claire Bennett. They met at Pine Valley Park on the walking trail that wound around the lake where Ethan had taught Lily to fish during those terrible months after Sarah's death. It was neutral ground, public enough to be safe, but private enough for honest conversation. Claire was waiting on a bench overlooking the water, still professional in her weekend clothes, but somehow more human without the armor of courtroom attire. When she saw him approaching, her expression was a mixture of relief and concern. Thank you for coming, she said as he sat beside her. I wasn't sure you would. Holloway got to you too. 3 job offers since yesterday night. Boston, Seattle, Washington, D.C. All from firms I've never heard of, offering twice what I make here. Her laugh held no humor. Amazing how quickly word of my exceptional legal talents has spread. You're thinking about taking one of them. I'm thinking about a lot of things. She turned to face him directly. Mr. Cole, Ethan, what happened last night, what you did. I can't adequately express my gratitude, but I also can't live with the consequences falling on you and your daughter. Those consequences aren't your fault. Aren't they? If I'd handled the situation differently, if I'd been more assertive earlier, if I'd left when I first felt uncomfortable. If. Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. You can play that game forever and never reach the end. Marcus Holloway and his friend chose to corner you. They chose to ignore your requests to leave you alone. I chose to intervene. Richard Holloway chose to retaliate. The only person responsible for this mess is the one making the threats. But I'm the one with options. I can leave. Start over somewhere else. You have a daughter, roots, a life here. And you have a practice clients who depend on you, your own life that you've built. They sat in silence for a moment, watching a family of ducks paddle across the lake in perfect formation. The simplicity of their movement was a stark contrast to the complexity of human choices and consequences. There's something else, Claire said finally. Something you should know about the Holloway family. I'm listening. I've been researching them since last night. Public records, news articles, court filings. Richard Holloway has been connected to at least 6 similar situations over the past 10 years. People who crossed the family, challenged them, refused to back down. All of them suffered what appeared to be unrelated misfortunes. Job losses, financial problems, legal troubles. But nothing that could be proven. Nothing that was ever investigated properly. The local authorities tend to be very accommodating when it comes to the Holloway family interests. What are you saying? I'm saying this isn't the first time they've used intimidation and economic warfare to silence opposition. And I'm saying that in every previous case, the person eventually left town, quietly, without making waves. And if they don't leave quietly, Claire's expression darkened. There was a journalist 5 years ago, freelancer named David Martinez. He was investigating some irregularities in county land deals contracts that seemed to favor Holloway development despite higher bids from competitors. What happened to him? Officially nothing. His investigation simply stopped. He left town suddenly citing family emergency. But I found something interesting in the archived police reports. 3 weeks before his departure, his apartment was burglarized. Nothing valuable was taken, but his computer was destroyed, and his research files were scattered. You think they broke in? I think David Martinez was a very careful man who backed up his work in multiple locations. And I think someone wanted to send him a message about the consequences of digging too deep into Holloway business. The implications settled over them like a gathering storm. This wasn't just about Marcus's bruised ego or Richard's wounded pride. This was about power maintaining itself, about the systematic silencing of anyone who dared to challenge the established order. There's more, Claire continued. I've been going through my own files looking at cases I've handled that involved Holloway interests. 3 wrongful termination suits that were suddenly dropped when the plaintiffs received anonymous job offers in other cities. 2 discrimination cases that died when the complainants moved away for family reasons. A pattern of problems disappearing rather than being resolved. And you never noticed this before. I noticed. I just told myself it was coincidence. People change their minds, accept settlements, decide the fight isn't worth it. But when you put it all together, it looks like a conspiracy. It looks like a system. One that's been operating for years, silencing opposition through intimidation, economic pressure, and the subtle application of institutional power. A jogger passed them on the trail, earbuds lost in her own world of controlled exertion and morning endorphins. Such a normal sight, such an ordinary moment in a conversation that was mapping the boundaries of corruption and consequence. So what do? Ethan asked. I don't know. But I know running away won't stop them. It'll just validate their methods and make them bolder for the next person who stands up to them. You're talking about fighting them. I'm talking about refusing to be silenced, about documenting what they're doing and finding a way to expose it. That's dangerous, for both of us, but especially for you. I'm trained for this kind of conflict. You're a civil rights attorney who swore an oath to defend justice and protect the vulnerable. What good is that oath if I abandon it the first time it becomes inconvenient? Ethan studied her face, seeing something there. He recognized the same look he'd seen in mirrors during the darkest moments of deployment, when mission success meant accepting risks that rational people would refuse. This isn't your fight, he said quietly. It became my fight the moment you stood up for me. And it's bigger than just us now. If we don't stop them here, they'll keep doing this to other people. How many have stayed silent? How many have been driven away? How many injustices have been covered up by fear and money? The questions hung in the air between them, unanswered but undeniable. In the distance, church bells were ringing, calling the faithful to worship and reflection. But here beside the lake, 2 people were wrestling with questions that had no easy answers, making choices that would define not just their own futures, but the kind of world they wanted to leave behind. If we do this, Ethan said finally, if we refuse to back down, it's going to get worse before it gets better, much worse. I know. They'll come after your practice, your reputation, everything you've built. I know. And my daughter. If something happens to me, if they manage to take her away, they won't. Claire's voice carried a conviction that surprised them both. Whatever happens, whatever they try to do, we won't let them hurt a child to protect their secrets. You don't know what they're capable of. And they don't know what we're capable of. They're used to fighting people who play by their rules, who accept their version of how the world works. But you're not just anybody, Ethan. You're someone who's faced down enemies before, and I'm someone who's spent her career fighting institutional power. This is different. This is personal. This is home. Which makes it more important, not less. They stood together looking out over the lake where families were setting up picnics and children were chasing geese along the shoreline. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that their community's power structure was built on intimidation and fear. "There's something else you should know," Claire said, as they prepared to leave. "I made some calls this morning, discreet inquiries with some colleagues in other cities. The Holloway pattern isn't unique to Cedar Falls." "What do you mean?" "I mean there are families like this in small towns across America. Local dynasties that use economic power and political connections to silence opposition. It's not a conspiracy, it's just the way things work when money concentrates in the hands of people who've forgotten that power comes with responsibility." "So this is bigger than Richard Holloway." "Much bigger. Which means stopping them here could matter more than just to us. It could be part of something larger, a stand that needs to be taken." As they walked back toward the parking area, Ethan felt the weight of decisions settling on his shoulders. Not just the choice between fight and flight, but the choice between the man he'd been and the man his daughter needed him to become. "Claire," he said as they reached their cars, "if we do this, if we decide to fight them, you need to know something about me, about who I was before I came here. I know you were military, special forces from what I've heard. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about why I left, why I brought Lily here and tried to build a life away from all of that." She waited, sensing the importance of whatever he was about to reveal. "I was good at what I did. Too good. And somewhere along the way I started to like it too much. The precision, the control, the ability to solve problems with violence. It was eating me alive, turning me into something a wife barely recognized. But you stopped. You chose a different path. I chose to try. But last night when I stepped between you and those men, for a moment I felt it again. That cold satisfaction of being in control, of making bad people pay for their choices. It scared me. Because you enjoyed it. Because it felt like coming home." Claire was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of his confession. When she spoke, her voice was carefully measured. "The man who enjoyed violence wouldn't have spent 3 years teaching Sunday school. He wouldn't have built the playground equipment at the community center as a volunteer project. He wouldn't have coached Little League for free because the kids needed someone who cared. You've been checking up on me. I've been trying to understand who you really are. Because if we're going to fight this together, I need to know what kind of man I'm standing with. And what kind of man do you think I am? The kind who spent 3 years proving that violence was your job, not your nature. The kind who changed everything about his life because he wanted to be a better father. The kind who stepped up last night not because he wanted to hurt someone, but because he couldn't stand to see someone else being hurt." Her words carried a weight of conviction that he wasn't sure he deserved, but they offered something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of redemption not through running from his past, but by choosing how to use it. "If we do this," he said, "if we decide to stand and fight, you need to understand what that means. They won't just come after our jobs or our reputations. They'll make it personal. They'll target everything we care about." "Let them try," Claire said, and there was steel in her voice that matched the determination in her eyes. "Let them find out what happens when they pick a fight with people who have nothing left to lose and everything worth fighting for." As they drove away in separate directions, the die was cast. 2 people who'd met in crisis had found common cause in resistance. The war Richard Holloway had threatened was about to become the war he hadn't expected, not against isolated individuals who could be pressured into submission, but against allies who understood that some things were worth the price of standing up. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, filled with the ordinary concerns of weekend life. But underneath the surface of normalcy, battle lines were being drawn, and strategies were being formed. Cedar Falls was about to discover that power corrupted was not power unassailable, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who had already lost everything except their principles. In a few hours, Lily would come home from her sleepover full of stories and excitement about her weekend adventures. And Ethan would have to decide how much of the truth to share with a 10-year-old who still believed that good people always won and justice always prevailed. Some truths he was learning were worth protecting. Others were worth fighting for. The question now was whether he had the strength to do both. The first sign of war came at 3:17 on Sunday morning, when the sound of shattering glass cut through the peaceful darkness of Elm Street like a scream through prayer. Ethan was already moving before his conscious mind processed the sound, 15 years of military training, launching him from sleep into action with the fluid precision of muscle memory. He reached Lily's room in 4 strides, finding her sitting up in bed, wide-eyed and trembling. Through her window, he could see the jagged hole in his truck's windshield, spider-webbed glass, catching streetlight like a frozen constellation of malice. "Dad." Lily's voice was small in the darkness, carrying all the confusion of childhood, confronting adult cruelty for the first time. "It's okay, sweetheart. Stay here." Ethan's voice was calm, controlled, but inside him something cold and familiar was awakening the part of himself he'd tried so hard to bury in the soil of ordinary life. He moved through the house with practiced silence, checking windows and doors, cataloging escape routes and defensive positions, with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd once made survival an art form. The rock that had shattered his windshield lay on the front seat, surrounded by glittering fragments, wrapped in a note that carried a message as clear as gunfire. "Last warning. Leave town, or next time it's the little girl's window." The words hit him like a physical blow, not for their threat to himself, but for their casual willingness to terrorize a child. Whatever restraint Richard Holloway had shown in their morning confrontation was gone now, replaced by the naked brutality of power defending itself against challenge. Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed 911, knowing even as he did that it was theater rather than hope. Cedar Falls Police Department operated under the same economic reality as everyone else in town. Their budget came from the city council, and the city council answered to families like the Holloways. Officer Janet Price arrived within 10 minutes, a decent woman in her 40s, who'd grown up 3 streets over and still remembered when the worst crime in Cedar Falls was teenage vandalism. She took photos, filed a report, and spoke with the weary sympathy of someone who understood the futility of the exercise. "Any idea who might have done this, Ethan?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "I have some ideas. Want to share them? Would it matter if I did?" Price was quiet for a long moment, her flashlight beam playing over the scattered glass. "You know my daughter Emma is in Lily's class. They're good friends." "They are." "Emma talks about her a lot. Says Lily's the kindest kid in school, always standing up for the kids who get picked on." Price looked up at him, her expression careful. "Sounds like she gets that from her father." "Officer Price." "Janet. And I'm not here as a cop right now, Ethan. I'm here as a neighbor who's watched you coach Little League for free and build playground equipment on your weekends off. As someone who knows the difference between good people and the other kind." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that sometimes good people find themselves in situations where the system can't protect them, where they have to make hard choices about what they're willing to accept and what they're willing to fight for. She handed him a business card, not her official police card, but something personal. "That's my cell number. If things get worse, if you need someone who remembers what police work is supposed to be about, you call me, day or night." After she left, Ethan sat on his front steps in the pre-dawn darkness, watching shadows move between streetlights and thinking about the mathematics of warfare. Superior force, unlimited resources, home field advantage. The Holloway family held every tactical card except the one that mattered most. They were fighting for dominance. He was fighting for survival. They had everything to protect. He had everything to lose. The difference, as any soldier could tell you, was everything. When Lily emerged for breakfast 3 hours later, Ethan had already covered the truck's windshield with plywood and swept up the glass. She noticed immediately, children always did, but her only comment was a quiet, "Are we in danger, Dad?" "We're being tested," he replied, which was both completely honest and utterly inadequate. "By bad people, by people who think they can scare us into giving up." And can they? Ethan knelt down until he was at her eye level, taking her small hands in his larger ones. "What do you think, Gimo?" Lily considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence. "I think if we give up, then the lady from the restaurant will be alone again. And other people will be alone too." "That's exactly right. So we don't give up. So we don't give up." But even as he spoke the words, Ethan felt the weight, spite of what he was committing them both to. This wasn't Afghanistan, where rules of engagement were clear and enemies wore uniforms. This was asymmetric warfare fought with social pressure and economic violence, where a 10-year-old girl became a legitimate target simply by virtue of being loved. His phone rang as they finished breakfast. Claire's voice was tight with controlled anger. "They hit my office last night. Broke in through the back door. Nothing stolen, but my computer was destroyed, and my files were scattered everywhere." Just like the journalist. Exactly like the journalist. But Ethan, there's something else. Something they didn't expect. "What's that?" "I'm paranoid. Have been since law school. I keep copies of everything in a safe deposit box across town, and I upload my most sensitive files to a secure cloud server every night." For the first time since the rock shattered his windshield, Ethan allowed himself a smile. "They broke in and found nothing. Worse than nothing. They found decoy files I keep for exactly this situation. Fake documents designed to look important, but actually containing completely fabricated information about non-existent cases. You set a trap. I set a trap. And now we know for certain that they're willing to commit actual crimes to protect their secrets. Breaking and entering, destruction of property, intimidation, it's all documented. Documented by whom? Janet Price seems like a good cop, but she's one person in a department that answers to people who answer to the Holloways. Then we go higher. State police, FBI, media outlets outside their sphere of influence. We make this too big for them to control. There was something in her voice that made Ethan pause, a particular quality of determination that he recognized from briefing rooms before dangerous missions. "Claire, what aren't you telling me? I've been making calls, reaching out to colleagues, journalists, advocacy groups, people who specialize in exposing corruption in small towns, and I found something interesting. Which is, we're not the first people to try to stand up to the Holloways, but we might be the first people with the resources and connections to do it effectively." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at Ethan's front door, 3 sharp raps that carried an authority unmistakably official. Through the peephole, he could see 2 men in dark suits, badges visible on their belts. Expressions neutral but watchful. Federal agents, he told Claire quietly. I'll call you back. The men introduced themselves as Special Agents Morrison and Park from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. They were polite, professional, and utterly terrifying in the way that only federal law enforcement could be when they arrived unannounced on a Sunday morning. Mr. Cole, Agent Morrison said, his voice carrying the particular authority of the federal government. We'd like to ask you some questions about your military service. My military service ended 3 years ago. Yes, we're aware, but there are some irregularities in your discharge paperwork that have come to our attention. Questions about certain incidents during your final deployment. Ethan felt the world shift beneath his feet, the careful life he'd built suddenly revealed as a house of cards in a hurricane. Whatever strings Richard Holloway had pulled, whatever favors he'd called in, they reached all the way to the federal level. I was discharged with honors. Initially, yes, but new information has come to light. Allegations of excessive force during a mission in Syria. Civilian casualties that may not have been properly reported. The lies were expertly crafted, threading through enough classified details to sound plausible, while remaining impossible to definitively disprove. Ethan recognized the hand of someone with access to military records and federal databases, access that cost serious money and serious connections. I want to speak to my attorney. Of course, that's your right. But Mr. Cole, you should understand that this investigation is ongoing. While it proceeds, certain restrictions may be necessary. Travel limitations, supervised visitation with minor children, standard precautions when dealing with individuals who may pose a security risk. The threat to Lily was delivered with bureaucratic precision, wrapped in legal language but unmistakably clear. Fight us, and we'll use the full weight of the federal government to destroy everything you care about. After the agents left, Ethan sat in his kitchen staring at their business cards and thinking about the machine that had just been turned against him. Not just Richard Holloway's money and influence, but the vast apparatus of federal law enforcement twisted into a weapon of personal vengeance. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Impressed, yet last chance to leave quietly. R.H. Ethan stared at this message for a long moment, then deleted it and called Claire. They sent federal agents, he said without preamble. What kind of federal agents? The kind that ask questions about classified military operations and threaten supervised visitation. Claire was quiet for several seconds, and when she spoke, her voice carried a new edge of understanding. Jesus. He's not just locally connected. He's got federal connections too. Which means this is bigger than we thought. Or smaller. Think about it, Ethan. If he had legitimate federal connections, he wouldn't need to fabricate charges and threaten children. He'd just make you disappear quietly through proper channels. So what does that mean? It means he's desperate. Desperate enough to cash in favors he probably can't afford to lose. Desperate enough to escalate to federal intimidation for what should be a local problem. Why would he be desperate? Because something about this situation scares him more than just losing face over his son's behavior. Something about you or me or what we represent threatens him at a fundamental level. Ethan found himself thinking about the pattern Claire had identified, the systematic silencing of opposition, the economic warfare, the careful application of institutional pressure. A machine that had been operating for years, feeding on the fear and compliance of ordinary people. What if we're not the first people to figure out how their system works? He said slowly. What if we're just the first people who might actually be able to do something about it? Explain. You're a civil rights attorney with connections outside their sphere of influence. I'm someone with training in unconventional warfare and nothing left to lose. Together, we represent something they've never faced before: incompetent opposition that can't be easily bought, intimidated, or discredited. So they're trying to destroy us before we can become a real threat. Which means they think we can become a real threat. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into Ethan's driveway. Through the window, he could see Mike Torres climbing out of his pickup truck, his expression grim with the weight of bad news. "I have to go," Ethan told Claire. "My boss is here." "Ethan, whatever he says, whatever they've threatened him with, remember that this is bigger than just your job now." Mike Torres looked like a man who'd aged 5 years in 2 days. His usual confident bearing was replaced by the slumped shoulders of someone carrying a burden too heavy for comfort. "Morning, Ethan." "Mike, I'm guessing this isn't a social call." "I wish it was." Mike ran a hand through his gray hair, a gesture Ethan had come to associate with difficult conversations. "I got another call this morning, from Holloway Development. Let me guess. They're reconsidering their contracts. Worse, they're calling in their existing contracts, claiming breach of safety standards, substandard workmanship, failure to meet deadlines. All bullshit, but legally actionable bullshit. How bad is it? $2.3 million in contracts, canceled as of Monday morning." Mike's voice was flat with the shock of financial catastrophe. "Without those contracts, I can't make payroll next week. Torres Construction is done." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. 43 families suddenly facing unemployment because their boss had employed someone who'd stood up to the wrong person's son. "Mike, I'm sorry. I never meant for this to... Don't." Mike's voice was sharp with pain and anger. "Don't you dare apologize for doing the right thing. You think I don't know what this is about? You think I haven't seen what the Holloway family does to people who cross them? Then why? Because some things matter more than money. Because I've got a daughter too, and I want her to grow up in a world where good people stand up to bullies, even when it costs them everything." Ethan stared at his friend, seeing something there he hadn't expected, not just resignation, but resolve. "There's something else," Mike continued. "Something you need to know about the Holloway contracts." "What's that?" "They've been padding the bills for years, charging the city for materials we never delivered, labor we never performed. I kept records because it didn't sit right with me, but I needed the work. You have evidence of fraud. Boxes of it. Invoices, delivery receipts, payroll records. Enough to prove they've been stealing from the city for at least 5 years. Why are you telling me this?" "Because if I'm going down anyway, I might as well take them with me. And because you're going to need ammunition if you want to fight them." The revelation hit Ethan like a tactical briefing before a complex operation. Suddenly, the battlefield looked different, the enemy's weaknesses more apparent. Richard Holloway wasn't just a local power broker defending his family's reputation. He was a criminal protecting a long-running fraud scheme. "Mike, if you turn over that evidence, they'll come after you with everything they have. They're already coming after me with everything they have. At least this way it means something." They were interrupted by the sound of another car in the driveway. This time it was a news van from KSFF, the regional television station. A young reporter climbed out, followed by a cameraman, both of them moving with the urgent energy of people chasing a breaking story. "Mr. Cole." The reporter was a woman in her 30s, professionally dressed, but with the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who'd been working weekends. "I'm Sarah Martinez from KSFF News. I understand you've been having some problems with the Holloway family. How did you..." "I received some very interesting documents this morning, anonymously delivered. Financial records, police reports, a pattern of harassment and intimidation going back years." She held up a manila envelope thick with papers. "Would you care to comment?" Ethan felt the world shift again, pieces of a larger puzzle suddenly clicking into place. Someone was moving chess pieces behind the scenes, someone with access to information and the ability to coordinate media attention at precisely the right moment. I'm not sure I should comment without speaking to my attorney first. Your attorney being Claire Bennett. How do you know that? Sarah Martinez smiled with the satisfaction of a reporter who'd done her homework. Because she's the one who called me. She thought you might want to tell your side of the story before the Holloway family controls the narrative. The next few hours passed in a blur of strategic conversations and tactical decisions. Claire arrived within minutes, followed by Janet Price in her personal vehicle rather than her patrol car. What had started as a personal conflict was rapidly evolving into something larger, a coordinated effort to expose the Holloway family's systematic abuse of power. The evidence Mike Torres provided was damning. 5 years of fraudulent contracts, inflated bills, phantom employees, a scheme that had stolen nearly $500,000 from the city's budget. But more than that, it revealed the mechanism by which the Holloway family maintained control. They provided essential services at inflated rates, ensuring dependence while skimming profits. This is how they buy influence, Claire explained as they spread documents across Ethan's kitchen table. They overpay for contracts, then distribute the excess as campaign contributions, charitable donations, and personal favors. It's a money laundering operation disguised as civic engagement. Sarah Martinez documented everything, her camera capturing the evidence, while her questions probed for the human story beneath the financial crimes. She was good at her job, Ethan realized, experienced enough to understand the implications of what they were showing her, connected enough to know which authorities could act on the information. This is going to be a big story, she said, as they finished the interview. Bigger than just local news. I have contacts at the State Attorney General's office, colleagues at major networks. This kind of small-town corruption story plays well nationally. How long before it goes public? Ethan asked. 24 hours. Maybe less if the Holloways try to stop it. Nothing accelerates a news cycle like attempted censorship. As evening approached, the War Council that had spontaneously formed in Ethan's kitchen began to disperse. Plans were made, contingencies discussed, battle lines drawn with the precision sought of a military operation. But underneath the tactical considerations, something more fundamental was taking shape. A community of resistance bound together by shared principles rather than shared interests. Janet Price was the last to leave, and she lingered on the front porch as darkness settled over Elm Street. Ethan, I want you to know something. What you did Friday night, what you're doing now, it matters. Not just to you and Lily, but to everyone in this town who's been afraid to speak up. Janet, if this goes wrong, if they come after you for helping us, then they come after me. But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. At least I'll be able to tell my daughter that when it mattered, her mom stood with the good guys. After everyone left, Ethan found himself alone with Lily in the quiet house where they'd built their life together. She was doing homework at the kitchen table, math problems and spelling words, the ordinary concerns of childhood continuing despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding them. Dad, she said without looking up from her worksheet, are we going to win? The question was asked with the casual confidence of a child who'd never seen good people lose, who still believed in the fundamental justice of the universe. Ethan wished he could share her certainty, but years of warfare had taught him that victory was never guaranteed, only earned through sacrifice and determination. I don't know, sweetheart, but I know we're going to try. Because it's the right thing to do. Because it's the right thing to do. Lily nodded, satisfied with this explanation, and returned to her homework. But Ethan remained at the table long after she'd gone to bed, thinking about the forces they'd set in motion and the price that might yet be demanded. Outside, Cedar Falls slept unaware that its comfortable equilibrium was about to be shattered. In boardrooms and back rooms, phones were ringing and plans were being made. By morning, the carefully constructed machine of the Holloway family's power would be grinding toward a confrontation that none of them had wanted, but all of them had made inevitable. Ethan's phone buzzed one final time before he turned in for the night. A text from an unknown number. "You have no idea what you've started. Last chance to stop this before people get hurt." This time, Ethan didn't delete the message. Instead, he forwarded it to Claire Janet Price and Sarah Martinez. Evidence of intimidation documented proof of the lengths the Holloway family would go to protect their secrets. Then he sent a reply, "People are already hurt. Time to make it stop." The response came within minutes, "You'll regret this." Ethan stared at the phone for a long moment, then typed his final message of the night. "The only thing I regret is waiting so long to fight back." As he prepared for bed, Ethan could feel the weight of decisions settling around him, like armor he'd thought he'd never wear again. Not the physical armor of military service, but the psychological armor of someone who'd chosen to stand between innocent people and those who would harm them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new tests of resolve. But tonight, for the first time since Friday evening at Murphy's Diner, Ethan Cole felt like himself again. Not the construction foreman trying to blend into small-town obscurity, not the former soldier running from his past, but the protector he'd always been at heart. In her bedroom down the hall, Lily slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams 10-year-olds dreamed when they felt safe and loved. And in the master bedroom, where Sarah's presence still lingered in the choice of curtains and the arrangement of furniture, Ethan lay awake planning for a war he'd never wanted but could no longer avoid. The enemy had superior numbers, unlimited resources, and home field advantage. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd threatened his daughter. And anyone who'd ever served alongside Ethan Cole in the dark corners of the world could have told them that was the one line they should never have crossed. The battle for Cedar Falls was about to begin in earnest, and for the first time since the rock shattered his windshield, Ethan was ready for the fight. In the morning, everything would change. But tonight, love was standing guard, and that was enough. The morning brought chaos with the sunrise. Ethan woke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly against the nightstand, a percussion of urgency that pulled him from dreams of Sarah and into the harsh reality of Monday's reckoning. The first call was from Claire, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "It's happening, Ethan. Sarah Martinez's story just went live on the morning show. The phone's been ringing non-stop. State Attorney General's office, federal investigators, journalists from 3 different networks." Through his bedroom window, Ethan could see a news van parked across the street. Its satellite dish pointed skyward like a technological prayer. Another van was arriving as he watched, followed by a sedan with government plates that screamed federal authority. "How bad is the fallout?" he asked, already knowing the answer would be measured in catastrophe. Richard Holloway's attorney called 15 minutes ago demanding a meeting. The city council has called an emergency session for this afternoon. And Mike Torres just texted Holloway Development is trying to serve him with a restraining order to prevent him from releasing any more documents. The machine was in motion now, grinding toward a confrontation that would reshape Cedar Falls whether anyone wanted it or not. But as Ethan pulled on his clothes and prepared to face the storm, he felt something unexpected relief. The waiting was over. The pretense of normal life had been stripped away, leaving only the clarity of open warfare. Lily appeared in his doorway, already dressed for school, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Through the window behind her, she could see the growing media circus in their quiet neighborhood. "Dad, why are there so many cars outside?" "Because sometimes when you stand up to bullies, other people notice. and some of those people want to help. Are we famous now? The innocence of the question hit him like a physical blow. Fame was the last thing he wanted for his daughter. Exposure meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant danger for a 10-year-old caught in the crossfire of adult conflicts. "We're just people doing what we think is right," he said carefully. "But Lily, things are going to be different for a while. There might be reporters who want to ask you questions, or people who say things about our family that aren't true." "Like what kinds of things?" How did you explain to a child that powerful people would try to destroy her father's reputation, question his fitness as a parent, and use her as leverage in their war against accountability? How did you prepare a 10-year-old for the systematic cruelty of institutional power protecting itself? Sometimes when grown-ups are angry, they say mean things that aren't true but are meant to hurt. If anyone tries to talk to you about Dad or about what happened at the restaurant, you tell them you need to talk to me first. Okay. She studied his face with the penetrating gaze that children possessed, seeing past his careful words to the worry beneath. "Dad, are you scared?" "I'm concerned, but not for the reasons you might think. I'm not scared of what they might do to me. I'm scared of what this might do to you. Because people might be mean to me too. Because you shouldn't have to deal with adult problems. You should be worried about math tests and soccer practice and whether Emma wants to come over for dinner." Lily considered this with the gravity of a philosopher contemplating existence. "But Dad, if kids don't see grown-ups standing up to bullies, how do we learn to stand up to them too?" The wisdom of the observation staggered him. Somewhere in the past few days, his 10-year-old daughter had grasped something that many adults never understood, that courage was not inherited, but learned, not given, but demonstrated, not talked about, but lived. "You're right," he said simply. "You're absolutely right." The drive to school became a gauntlet of media attention. Reporters called out questions from behind police barriers, cameras tracked their movement, and Lily stared out the window with the wide-eyed fascination of someone watching her ordinary world transform into something from television. "Mr. Cole, can you comment on the allegations against the Holloway family? Is it true you're a former Navy SEAL? What do you say to charges that you used excessive force?" Ethan ignored them all, focused on delivering his daughter to the safety of Cedar Falls Elementary, where Principal Anderson was waiting, with the grim expression of someone whose quiet school had suddenly become the center of regional attention. "Mr. Cole," Anderson said, as Lily disappeared into the building, "we need to talk." They sat in his office surrounded by children's artwork and achievement awards, the innocent decorations a stark contrast to the adult concerns that had invaded this space of learning and growth. "I've received 3 calls this morning," Anderson began. "One from the school board, one from the superintendent, and one from someone claiming to represent concerned parents. Let me guess. Concerns about my fitness as a parent. Questions about whether Lily is safe in my care. Concerns about disruption to the educational environment. Questions about whether the school can ensure student safety with media attention focused on one family. Are you suspending her? I'm asking you to consider alternative arrangements. Temporary homeschooling perhaps until this situation resolves itself." The request was delivered with apologetic firmness, but Ethan could see the pressure behind it. Phone calls from influential board members, threats to school funding, the subtle application of institutional power to isolate and neutralize opposition. "Principal Anderson, with respect, my daughter has done nothing wrong. She's an honor student, a good friend to her classmates, and a positive influence in this school. Punishing her for my choices sends exactly the wrong message to every child who might someday face the choice between doing right and doing nothing. Mr. Cole, I understand your position, but you're being pressured to treat my daughter like a pariah because her father stood up to the wrong family. How is that different from teaching children that might makes right, that money and influence matter more than justice and courage? Anderson was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photos of graduating classes that lined his office walls, decades of young faces full of hope and possibility. You're right, he said finally. You're absolutely right. Lily stays in school. If the board has a problem with that, they can take it up with me directly. The stand was small but significant, another crack in the facade of universal compliance that the Holloway family had worked years to construct. As Ethan left the school, he could feel the battlefield shifting, alliances forming in unexpected places. His phone rang as he reached the parking lot. Sarah Martinez, her voice crackling with the energy of a journalist sensing a major story. Ethan, you need to get to the courthouse, now. The FBI just served search warrants on Holloway Development, the city planning office, and 3 members of the city council. The federal response was swift and overwhelming. By the time Ethan reached downtown Cedar Falls, FBI agents were streaming in and out of the Holloway Development building, with boxes of evidence while news crews documented every moment. The carefully constructed image of respectability was crumbling in real-time, broadcast live to a regional audience hungry for small-town corruption stories. Richard Holloway emerged from his office flanked by 3 attorneys, his usual composure replaced by the controlled panic of someone watching his empire disintegrate. When he saw Ethan standing among the crowd of onlookers, their eyes met across the chaos with the recognition of mutual enemies. "This isn't over," Holloway called out, his voice carrying over the noise of investigation and documentation. "You think you've won something here? You have no idea what you've cost this town." "I know exactly what it's cost," Ethan replied, his voice calm but carrying enough to be heard by the assembled crowd. "It's cost the illusion that power without accountability is acceptable. It's cost the pretense that good people should stay silent while bad people do whatever they want." The exchange was captured by a dozen cameras, the moment crystallizing the conflict between institutional power and individual conscience. But more than that, it revealed something that surprised everyone, including Ethan himself. The crowd was on his side. Spontaneous applause broke out among the gathered citizens, not just for his words, but for the courage to speak them publicly. These were people who'd watched the Holloway family operate for years, who'd seen neighbors disappear rather than fight, who'd accepted the system because challenging it seemed impossible. "About time someone stood up to them," called out Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman whose rooster crowed despite city ordinances. "My brother lost his business 5 years ago for bidding against Holloway," added Tom Fisher, owner of the hardware store. "Suddenly he couldn't get permits, couldn't get inspections passed, had to sell and move to Bakerstown." More voices joined in a chorus of grievances that had been whispered in private for years, but never voiced in public. The fear that had maintained the Holloway family's control was evaporating in the sunlight of exposure, replaced by the dangerous courage of people who'd been silent too long. Claire appeared at Ethan's side, her professional composure barely containing her excitement. "The federal investigation is bigger than we thought. They're not just looking at financial crimes, they're investigating a pattern of civil rights violations, mail fraud, and conspiracy under the RICO Act." "RICO? That's organized crime legislation." "Exactly. The systematic use of intimidation, economic coercion, and institutional corruption to silence opposition. It fits the definition perfectly." The implications were staggering. What had started as a simple confrontation in a diner had exposed a criminal enterprise that had operated for years under the protection of respectability and local influence. But with federal attention came federal resources, and the Holloway family's regional power meant nothing against the unlimited reach of the Justice Department. The afternoon brought a parade of revelations as federal investigators methodically dismantled the financial structure that had supported years of corruption. Bank records revealed a complex web of shell companies and inflated contracts. Email servers yielded communications that showed deliberate coordination to suppress opposition and manipulate local politics. The scope of the criminal enterprise was far larger than anyone had imagined. But with each revelation came escalation from the Holloway side. Richard Holloway's attorneys filed emergency injunctions trying to halt the investigation. Friendly media outlets began running stories questioning the federal government's jurisdiction in local matters. Political allies at the state level promised legislative hearings into federal overreach. The war was no longer confined to Cedar Falls. It had become a battleground for larger questions about power accountability and the price of challenging entrenched interests. But as the stakes rose, so did the danger for everyone involved. The first direct threat came at 3 o'clock, when Derek Nash Marcus's companion from the restaurant confrontation appeared at Torres Construction, demanding to see Ethan. Mike Torres, still working, despite his business's collapse, met him at the gate. "Cole's not here," Mike said, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from Derek's coiled posture. "Then give him a message. Tell him this ends today or it ends badly, for everyone." "You threatening me, Derek?" "I'm stating facts. The FBI can investigate all they want, but they can't protect everyone all the time. Accidents happen. People get hurt. Little girls walk to school alone every morning." The threat to Lily was delivered with casual malice, but Mike Torres had spent 30 years in construction, dealing with men who thought intimidation was a substitute for competence. His response was measured but unmistakable. "Derek, you need to understand something. This isn't just about Ethan anymore. You just threatened a child in front of a dozen witnesses. Every one of my guys heard you. Every one of them has daughters, nieces, granddaughters. You want to start a war with the working men of this town." Around the construction yard, work had stopped. 43 men in hard hats and work boots stood watching the exchange, their expressions ranging from anger to disgust. These were men who understood violence as a last resort, but had no tolerance for threats against children. Derek looked around, apparently realizing for the first time that his intimidation tactics had landed him in hostile territory. The Holloway family's influence might reach into boardrooms and government offices, but it carried no weight among men who earned their living with their hands and measured character by actions rather than bank accounts. "This isn't over," Derek said, backing toward his car. "No, it's not," Mike agreed. "But if anything happens to that little girl, if anything happens to anyone standing up to your bosses, we'll know exactly where to look. And federal investigation or no federal investigation, there'll be a reckoning." The exchange was witnessed by 2 FBI agents who had arrived to interview employees about the Holloway contracts. Derek's threats were documented, photographed, and added to a growing file of evidence that painted a picture of a criminal organization willing to escalate to violence when other methods failed. By evening, Cedar Falls felt like a town under siege. Federal agents moved through the streets with the methodical efficiency of an occupation force. News crews broadcast live updates from locations that had never seen such attention. And in the shadows, the Holloway family's remaining allies worked desperately to contain damage that was spreading faster than wildfire. Ethan returned home to find Janet Price sitting in her patrol car outside his house, not as official police presence, but as a neighbor standing guard. She rolled down her window as he approached. "Figured you might appreciate some extra eyes tonight," she said. Derek Nash made some interesting statements this afternoon. Made them in front of federal agents, which wasn't his brightest move. Is he in custody? Not yet, but he's being watched, along with Marcus and about 6 other Holloway associates. The FBI takes threats against witnesses very seriously. And Richard Holloway himself, lawyered up tighter than Fort Knox, but his attorneys can't unring the bell. The evidence is out there, the investigation is official, and the story's gone national. CNN picked it up an hour ago. The national attention was both validation and escalation. What had started as a local conflict was becoming a symbol of larger struggles between power and accountability, between entrenched corruption and grassroots resistance. But symbols Ethan knew from military experience often paid the highest price for the causes they represented. Inside the house, Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table with the determined focus of a child trying to maintain normalcy in abnormal circumstances. She looked up when he entered, her expression carrying questions she was too young to ask, but old enough to understand. "How was school today, sweetheart?" "Different. Some kids' parents told them not to talk to me. But Emma said her mom said I was brave like my dad." The casual cruelty of adults poisoning children's friendships for political purposes hit him harder than any physical threat. This was what he'd feared most, his choices becoming her burden, his battles becoming her isolation. "I'm sorry, Lily. You shouldn't have to deal with any of this." "Dad, remember what you taught me about standing up to bullies?" "What about it?" "You said sometimes good people have to make hard choices, even when it costs them things they care about." "That's right." "Well, talking to me doesn't cost anything. If some kids' parents are too scared to let them be friends with me, then maybe their kids need to learn about courage from someone else." The wisdom of innocence struck him speechless. His 10-year-old daughter had grasped something that many adults never understood, that courage was contagious, that standing up to injustice inspired others to do the same, and that the cost of doing right was always worth paying. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Claire stood on the porch, her expression mixing triumph with exhaustion. "We won," she said simply. "The city council just voted unanimously to suspend all contracts with Holloway Development pending the outcome of the federal investigation. Richard Holloway resigned from the school board an hour ago. 3 city council members have announced they won't seek re-election. And the criminal charges. Federal prosecutor says indictments are coming. Mail fraud, civil rights violations, racketeering. Richard Holloway is looking at 10 to 15 years if convicted." The victory was sweet but incomplete. Criminal charges would take months to resolve, and wealthy defendants with expensive attorneys had ways of minimizing consequences that ordinary people could never access. What about Derek's threats? What about the escalation? Derek Nash was arrested 2 hours ago for witness intimidation. Marcus Holloway is being questioned about conspiracy charges. And the FBI has assigned a protective detail for you and Lily until the threat assessment is complete. For the first time in days, Ethan allowed himself to feel something approaching relief. Not victory that would take time to achieve, but the possibility that justice might actually prevail over power, that courage might triumph over corruption. But even as they celebrated the day's developments, the phone rang with news that reminded them how dangerous wounded enemies could be. Sarah Martinez's voice was tight with urgency. "Ethan, there's been an incident. Someone firebombed Mike Torres's house tonight. He and his family are safe, they weren't home, but the message is clear." The escalation to violence shattered any illusion that this was purely a legal matter. The Holloway family and their associates had crossed the line from intimidation to terrorism, from white-collar crime to acts of destruction that endangered innocent families. "This is what happens when desperate people realize they're going to lose," Claire said, after Ethan relayed the news. They lash out, try to salvage something through fear and violence. Or if they're preparing for a final offensive, burning bridges, eliminating evidence, making sure that anyone who might testify against them understands the consequences. The possibility hung in the air between them like smoke from the Torres house fire. This wasn't over, it was entering its most dangerous phase where rational calculation gave way to desperate action and personal safety became secondary to survival. Outside, the FBI protective detail was taking positions around the house with the quiet efficiency of professionals who understood that real threats required real protection. But Ethan knew from experience that determined enemies could overcome any security if they were willing to pay the price. As Lily prepared for bed, she asked the question that had been haunting him since the threats began. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" "We're going to be fine, sweetheart. There are good people watching out for us, and bad people are going to face consequences for their choices, even if they try to hurt us first." The question cut to the heart of every parent's nightmare, the possibility that protecting others might endanger your own child, that doing right might cost everything you held dear. Lily, sometimes standing up to bullies means they try to hurt you worse before they stop. But that doesn't mean you stop standing up. It means you get help from other good people, and you keep fighting until the bullies learn that fear doesn't work anymore. Like what you're doing now. Like what we're doing now. Because you were the one who asked me to help that lady. You were the one who couldn't stand to see someone being hurt. We're in this together. She hugged him, then her small arms wrapping around his neck, with the fierce love of a child who understood that her father was fighting for more than just their family. He was fighting for the kind of world she deserved to inherit. As the house settled into uneasy quiet, Ethan stood watch at the window, observing the federal agents positioned around his property, like guardian angels in tactical gear. The sight should have been reassuring, but military training had taught him that the most dangerous enemies were those with nothing left to lose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, new tests of the fragile coalition that had formed around principles of justice and accountability. The federal investigation would continue, the media attention would intensify, and the legal machinery would grind toward eventual resolution. But tonight, in the darkness where desperate men made desperate plans, the real war was just beginning. Richard Holloway and his allies had built their power on the assumption that ordinary people would always choose safety over principle, comfort over courage. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The firebombing of Mike Torres's house was more than an act of intimidation. It was a declaration that the Holloway family would rather burn Cedar Falls to the ground than surrender their control over it. But fires, as any veteran knew, could spread in unexpected directions, and sometimes the people who started them were the first to be consumed by the flames. The flames that consumed Mike Torres's house cast an orange glow against the Cedar Falls sky that could be seen for miles, a beacon of desperation that marked the moment when the Holloway family's war against accountability crossed the line from intimidation into outright terrorism. But fires, as Ethan had learned in the burned-out villages of Afghanistan, had a way of illuminating more than their creators intended. The arsonist was caught within 6 hours. Derek Nash's mistake wasn't the firebombing itself. It was using his own vehicle to flee the scene, captured on 3 different security cameras, with timestamp and license plate clearly visible. When FBI agents kicked down his door at dawn, they found gasoline residue on his clothes accelerant in his garage, and a cell phone full of text messages coordinating the attack with Marcus Holloway himself. Ethan learned about the arrests from Agent Morrison, who arrived at his house as the Tuesday morning sun painted Cedar Falls in shades of hope and vindication. "Nash is talking," Morrison said without preamble. "Sang like a canary the moment we showed him the security footage. Gave us Marcus Holloway, 2 city council members, and a county judge who's been taking Holloway money for 8 years. And Richard Holloway, still lawyered up, but his own son just became a cooperating witness. Amazing how quickly family loyalty dissolves when federal prison becomes a real possibility. The domino effect was swift and merciless. By noon, arrest warrants had been issued for 6 more Holloway associates. By evening, the state attorney general had announced a comprehensive investigation into corruption in 3 neighboring counties. What had started as a single father protecting a stranger in a diner had become the catalyst for the largest political scandal in the region's history. But for Ethan, the most important moment came at 3 o'clock that afternoon, when Principal Anderson called to say that Lily's classmates were planning a surprise party to celebrate her father's courage. The children, it seemed, understood justice in ways their parents had forgotten. The party was small but significant. 12 10-year-olds gathered in the school cafeteria with homemade cookies and hand-drawn cards that said things like, "Your dad is a hero," and "Thank you for helping people." Emma Fisher, the hardware store owner's daughter, stood up with the solemn dignity of a child delivering important news. "My dad says your dad taught the whole town that bullies only win when good people do nothing. And my mom says that makes you brave too, because you asked him to help." Lily beamed with pride that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with the validation of her moral compass. She looked at her father with eyes that saw not a warrior or a protector, but simply a man who'd chosen to do the right thing when it mattered most. "Dad," she whispered, as they walked home through streets that felt different now, cleaner somehow, as if the removal of hidden corruption had actually changed the quality of the air. "I'm glad we didn't run away." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." The federal trials began 6 months later and lasted through the following spring. Richard Holloway, facing overwhelming evidence and the testimony of his own son, eventually pleaded guilty to racketeering charges and was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The judge's comments during sentencing became national news. "Mr. Holloway, you used wealth and influence to create a system where justice was for sale and opposition was crushed through systematic intimidation. You corrupted institutions that existed to serve the public good and turned them into weapons of personal enrichment. The sentence of this court reflects not just your crimes, but the need to send a clear message that no one, regardless of wealth or connections, is above the law." Derek Nash received 8 years. Marcus Holloway, in exchange for his cooperation, got 3 years and permanent banishment from Cedar Falls. The 3 city council members were sentenced to probation and community service. Their political careers ended forever. But the most dramatic moment came during Claire Bennett's testimony about the pattern of intimidation and silencing that had characterized the Holloway family's operations. As she detailed case after case of people driven from town rather than face economic warfare, a remarkable thing happened. The courtroom gallery filled with victims who had been silent for years. David Martinez, the journalist who'd been driven away after investigating Holloway development, returned to testify about the break-in that had destroyed his research. The businessman who'd lost everything for bidding against Holloway contracts told his story to a rapt audience. One by one, the shadows were dispelled by the light of truth. "For 15 years, Claire said in her closing statement, the Holloway family operated under the assumption that power without accountability was their birthright. They were wrong. Justice delayed is not justice denied, and this courtroom proves that courage once awakened cannot be silenced." The transformation of Cedar Falls was gradual but profound. Torres Construction rebuilt with insurance money and new contracts from companies that had previously been afraid to compete with Holloway Development became a symbol of economic resilience. Mike Torres hired back every employee who wanted to return and established a scholarship fund for children of working families. The new city council, elected in a landslide that saw 93% voter turnout, implemented transparency measures that made all city business public record. The police department, under Janet Price's leadership, after she was elected sheriff, created a citizen oversight board that ensured law enforcement served justice rather than power. Most importantly, the culture of fear that had paralyzed civic engagement for years began to dissolve. Town hall meetings went from sparsely attended rubber stamp sessions to vigorous debates about community priorities. Local businesses, no longer afraid of Holloway retaliation, began competing on merit rather than connections. The ripple effects extended far beyond Cedar Falls. Sarah Martinez's reporting on the case won a Pulitzer Prize and inspired similar investigations in small towns across America. The Cedar Falls model became shorthand for community-based resistance to institutional corruption. But for Ethan, the most meaningful change was smaller and more personal. On a warm October evening, almost exactly 1 year after the confrontation at Murphy's Diner, he sat on his front porch watching Lily play soccer in the yard with Emma and half a dozen other children, whose parents no longer worried about the consequences of friendship. Claire joined him on the porch steps, her legal practice thriving with a client base that included everyone from whistleblowers to community activists. She'd been offered positions with prestigious firms in major cities, but chose to stay in Cedar Falls where her work meant something beyond billable hours. "Any regrets?" she asked, watching the children's game with the contentment of someone who'd found her purpose. "About what standing up to bullies, protecting my daughter's friend, refusing to let powerful people terrorize ordinary citizens. About the price we all paid. The stress, the threats, the months of uncertainty." Ethan considered the question seriously. The past year had been the most difficult of his civilian life, more challenging in some ways than his military service, because the enemy wore familiar faces and fought from positions of respectability. There had been sleepless nights, moments of doubt, and the constant weight of knowing that his choices affected not just himself, but everyone around him. "The only thing I regret," he said finally, "is that it took my daughter's question to make me act. Daddy, can we help her? That's what changed everything." A 10-year-old sense of right and wrong cutting through all the adult rationalizations about why we shouldn't get involved. And now she's growing up in a town where standing up to injustice is normal rather than exceptional, where good people don't have to choose between doing right and feeling safe, where courage is contagious instead of dangerous. They sat in comfortable silence watching the children play as the sun set over a community that had rediscovered its own strength. In the distance, the bells of St. Mary's Church began their evening call, the same bells that had rung through decades of Holloway dominance but somehow sounded different now, cleaner, more hopeful. Lily scored a goal and ran to the porch with the breathless excitement of childhood victory. "Dad, did you see? I saw everything, sweetheart. I'm proud of you." "Not just the goal," she said, her expression becoming more serious. "Mrs. Martinez at the grocery store told Mom, Emma, that I should be proud of my dad because he changed the whole town. Is that true? What do you think?" Lily looked around the yard, where children from different families played together without fear, at the neighbors who waved instead of avoiding eye contact, at the sense of safety that came not from the absence of conflict, but from the knowledge that good people would stand together when it mattered. "I think we all changed the town," she said, with the wisdom that sometimes emerges from innocence. "But it started when someone asked the right question." What question was that? Can we help her? 3 simple words that had reshaped a community, toppled a corrupt dynasty, and proved that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose to use it. The question that had transformed a single father's promise to leave violence behind into a commitment to stand between the vulnerable and those who would exploit them. As darkness fell over Cedar Falls, Ethan called the children inside for dinner. Claire joined them, as she had most evenings since the trials ended, part of the extended family that had grown from shared struggle and mutual support. They gathered around the kitchen table where months earlier they had spread evidence of corruption and planned the campaign that would bring down the Holloway empire. "Dad," Lily said, as they passed plates of homemade pizza and salad from the garden Sarah had planted years ago, "tell us the story about the butterfly again." It was still her favorite story, the one about how her mother had spent an entire afternoon helping a butterfly with a damaged wing. But the telling had evolved over the past year, becoming not just a memory of Sarah's kindness, but a parable about the power of compassion to transform weakness into strength. "Your mom found this butterfly." Ethan began, his voice warm with love and remembrance, lying on the sidewalk with its wing torn and twisted. "Everyone said it would never fly again, that she should just let nature take its course." "But she didn't," Lily prompted, though she knew every word of the story by heart. "But she didn't. She created a shelter, fed it sugar water, kept it safe while it healed. Day after day, week after week, she tended to this broken creature that everyone else had written off. And then what happened? Then one morning she went to check on it and found the shelter empty. She thought maybe it had died during the night, that all her efforts had been wasted. But when she stepped outside, it was flying," Lily exclaimed with delight. "Flying in circles around her head like it was saying thank you. Flying better than it ever had before," Ethan confirmed. "Because sometimes healing makes us stronger than we were to begin with." Claire smiled at the parallel that wasn't lost on any of them. Cedar Falls, like Sarah's butterfly, had emerged from its period of healing stronger and more beautiful than before. The trauma of exposing corruption had been painful but necessary, like the setting of a broken bone that allowed for proper healing. "I wish I could have met your mom," Claire said to Lily. "She sounds like she was an amazing woman." "She was," Lily replied with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child secure in love. "But she would have liked you. Dad says you remind him of her sometimes." "How's that?" "Because you both believe in helping people even when it's hard, even when other people say it's impossible." The simple truth of the observation settled over them like a blessing. This was what Sarah would have wanted, not for Ethan to remain frozen in grief, but for him to find ways to honor her memory through continued service to others. The family they'd created wasn't a replacement for what was lost, but an extension of what had always been true about their values. After dinner, as Claire helped clear the dishes and Lily worked on homework that no longer carried the shadow of social isolation, Ethan's phone rang with a call that reminded him how far their story had traveled. "Mr. Cole, this is Maria Santos from the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. I'm calling about a situation in Millbrook County about 300 miles south of you. We have credible reports of a pattern of intimidation and corruption similar to what you exposed in Cedar Falls. How can I help?" "The local attorney working the case has requested consultation with you and Ms. Bennett. Apparently, your experience in organizing community resistance to institutional corruption has become something of a blueprint for similar situations." Ethan looked around his kitchen at the normal domestic scene that represented everything he'd fought to protect. The idea of leaving this hard-won peace to help strangers in distant towns face their own battles carried both appeal and apprehension. "Mr. Cole, are you there?" "I'm here. Just thinking about what you're asking." "We're not asking you to relocate or take on a permanent assignment. Just a consultation. Share what you learned, help them understand how to build the kind of community coalition that made your success possible. Can I call you back? I need to discuss this with my family. After he hung up, Lily looked up from her math homework with the penetrating gaze that had started everything. Dad, are you going to help those people? I don't know yet, sweetheart. It would mean traveling, being away from home sometimes. And it might mean dealing with dangerous people who don't want to be exposed. Like the Holloways. Lily considered this with the seriousness of someone who'd learned that choices had consequences, that courage required sacrifice, and that some things were worth the risk. Dad, remember what you taught me about bullies. What about them? That they only stop when good people make them stop, and that if we don't help people who are being hurt, then who will? The echo of her own words from that night at Murphy's Diner hit him with the force of recognition. His daughter had internalized the lesson so completely that she was now teaching it back to him, closing a circle of moral education that had begun with Sarah's butterfly and continued through their shared ordeal with the Holloway family. What do you think I should do? I think you should help them, Claire said quietly. Not because you owe anyone anything, but because this is who you are, who you've always been even when you were trying to hide from it. And what about our life here, our peace? Our peace was bought with struggle, Claire reminded him. And it'll only last if we're willing to help others find their own. 3 weeks later, Ethan found himself in a courthouse in Millbrook County, testifying before a grand jury about the patterns of corruption he'd helped expose in Cedar Falls. The local power structure was different, a family of judges rather than developers, but the methods were identical. Economic intimidation, systematic silencing of opposition. The corruption of institutions meant to serve the public good. The attorney leading the case was a young woman named Patricia Cruz, who reminded him of Claire in her fierce dedication to justice. She'd been threatened, her office vandalized, her clients intimidated. But she'd also done her homework studying the Cedar Falls case until she understood not just the legal strategies, but the community organizing that had made victory possible. The key, Ethan explained to a room full of local activists and concerned citizens, isn't just gathering evidence of corruption. It's building a coalition broad enough that they can't silence everyone. They can target individuals, but they can't target an entire community. But how do you overcome the fear? Asked a man whose brother had been driven out of business for challenging the local power structure. How do you convince people to take risks when they have families to protect? You start with the people who've already been hurt, Claire answered. She'd flown down for the weekend, bringing Lily, who was now something of a celebrity among children who'd heard the story of the little girl whose question changed a town. The ones who have nothing left to lose. Then you show others that resistance is possible, that bullies can be beaten if good people stand together. And what about the children? Asked a mother whose daughter had been ostracized at school because her father had spoken out against judicial corruption. How do you protect them from the consequences of adult choices? Lily looked up from the coloring book she'd been working on. Her crayon paused mid-stroke. You teach them that being brave is more important than being popular. And you make sure they know that good people will always stand with them, even when it's hard. The simple wisdom of childhood cut through adult complexity with surgical precision. The room fell silent, absorbing the truth that came not from legal expertise or tactical knowledge, but from the moral clarity of someone who'd lived through the storm and emerged stronger. The Millbrook County case took 8 months to resolve, ending with convictions that mirrored the Cedar Falls results. But more importantly, it established a model that was replicated in dozens of similar situations across the country. The Department of Justice created a task force specifically focused on institutional corruption in small communities, using the lessons learned from Cedar Falls to guide their investigations. Ethan found himself consulting on cases from Oregon to Florida, always returning home to Cedar Falls, but carrying the message that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose to exercise it. He never stayed away long. Lily's soccer games and school plays were non-negotiable priorities, but the work provided a sense of purpose that connected his military training to civilian service in ways he'd never imagined. The 2-year anniversary of the Murphy's Diner confrontation was marked not with celebration, but with service. The town organized a community volunteer day, with dozens of families working together to clean parks, paint public buildings, and maintain the spaces that belong to everyone. It was Lily's idea, proposed during a student council meeting, where she'd argued that the best way to honor their town's transformation was to keep working to make it better. As Ethan watched his daughter directing her classmates in planting flowers around the community center, he felt Sarah's presence more strongly than he had in years. Not as grief or loss, but as continuation, the values she'd embodied living on through their daughter's actions and his own choices. She would be proud, Claire said, joining him on the bench where they'd swapped during those first uncertain days of resistance. Of Lily, absolutely. Of all of us. Of what we built from what seemed like ruin. Ethan nodded, watching the children work, with the focused intensity of people who understood that community was something you created, rather than something you inherited. They were growing up in a different world than the one he and Claire had known as children, a world where standing up to injustice was normal rather than exceptional, where courage was modeled by adults who'd chosen principle over comfort. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd made different choices?" Claire asked. "If you'd just ignored what was happening to me that night?" "Every day," Ethan admitted, "but not with regret, with gratitude that we had the chance to choose correctly. And if we had to do it again, knowing what we know now about the cost." Ethan considered the question as he watched Lily laugh with her friends, their joy unencumbered by the adult knowledge of how hard-won their freedom really was. She was 12 now, old enough to understand the full story of their family's role in changing Cedar Falls, but young enough to believe that such changes were possible anywhere people had the courage to try. "I'd make the same choices," he said finally, "because the alternative, teaching my daughter that good people stay silent when bad things happen, was never really an option. Even knowing that it would mean years of conflict, threats, trials, the constant pressure of being in the public eye. Especially knowing that. Because conflict was temporary, but the lessons we taught about courage, about justice, about the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change, those are permanent." The sun was setting over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Ethan of other sunsets in other places where he'd stood guard over sleeping innocents. But this was different, not the vigilance of a soldier in hostile territory, but the peaceful attention of a father watching his community thrive. As the volunteer day wound down and families began gathering their tools and heading home, Lily ran over with dirt under her fingernails and satisfaction in her eyes. "Dad, Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you can help her nephew in Oregon. She says his town has the same problems we used to have." "What did you tell her?" "I told her we'd have to talk about it as a family, but that usually when people ask for help, we try to help them." The matter-of-fact certainty in her voice carried the weight of inherited wisdom. She'd learned not just from their specific experience with the Holloway family, but from the broader principle that Sarah had lived, and that Ethan had finally embraced, that love expressed through service to others was the highest calling any person could answer. "We'll talk about it," he promised. "We'll talk about it as a family." That evening, as they gathered around the dinner table for the family meeting that had become their method for making important decisions, Ethan felt the presence of everyone who'd made their victory possible. Mike Torres, rebuilding his business with integrity as its foundation. Janet Price, leading a police department that served justice rather than power. Sarah Martinez, using her platform to expose corruption wherever she found it. And Sarah Cole, whose memory lived on in every choice they made to help rather than harm, to build rather than destroy. So, Lily said, with the gravity of someone calling an important meeting to order who wants to help the people in Oregon. 3 hands went up around the table, Ethan's, Claire's, and Lily's own small hand raised high with the confidence of someone who'd learned that helping others was not just possible but necessary. Then that's what we'll do, Ethan said, and in those words was the promise that the story begun in Murphy's Diner would continue wherever good people needed help standing up to bullies, wherever courage needed a catalyst, wherever someone asked the simple question that could change everything. Can we help her? The answer they'd learned was always yes. Outside, the stars emerged over Cedar Falls like distant lights of hope, each one representing another community where ordinary people might choose extraordinary courage. Another place where a child's question might spark a transformation. Another story of love triumphing over fear. And in the kitchen where it all began, a family that had been forged by struggle and strengthened by service made plans to carry their light to wherever darkness needed dispelling, one act of courage at a time.